Hello, and welcome to our monthly Innovations in Global Tobacco Control lecture series. My name is Grazi Grillo, and I'm a program officer and Latin America regional lead at the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. It is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of 2024, my fellow Brazilian colleague and friend, Dr. André Luiz Oliveira da Silva. Professor Silva has over 16 years of experience in tobacco control regulation, policy development, enforcement, and implementation, including work at the Tobacco Control Office of the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency since 2007, including serving as head of the office for many years. Since 2009, Silva has actively participated in global discussion forums for the implementation of the World Health Organization Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, specifically tobacco product contents and emissions. And in 2019, he was nominated by the Framework Secretariat as one of the 10 global experts to address questions related to the implementation of policies related to tobacco products contents and emissions. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, and visiting professor at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil. His current research focuses on subliminal menthol and global regulation of additives in tobacco products. André, welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Grazi, for a nice presentation and kind words. So, good morning to everyone. I'm here today to talk about the challenges to regulate additives in tobacco and nicotine products. And this is the very challenging topic because most of countries face several technical problems, and the tobacco industry strategies to face this issue, it's pretty harsh to face. And here I'm show not only the why the tobacco companies use the additives in tobacco products, but how the tobacco companies try to stop the regulations to ban this kind of product. So basically, most of people believes that the additives are used only to make flavored tobacco products or nicotine products. But okay, it's a very important use of additives in tobacco products, but this is just the tip of iceberg. So you need to address the all aspects of the use of additives. So basically nowadays you have a plenty of flavored products, and looking for the tobacco companies documents hosted here in UCSF, and you could find some tips why the tobacco companies use additives in tobacco products. As I mentioned, the first use, it's the more obvious, it's to make sweet products or products with a pleasant taste, and especially to attract teenagers, kids and teenagers. And but we have another tips. For example, the additives could be used to reinforce the social acceptance of the tobacco products, and the additives could be used to give an impress of healthier product. And because the studies from tobacco companies shows that the sweet products and the added products could it give the impression for the users that this product it's more healthier, more safer, because the harshness it's a physiological feeling that it's important to show the aversion of the product. When you reduce the harshness and the impact of nicotine, your brain think, oh, it's okay now. I can smoke more because this is not problematic. So the tobacco companies are very clear to show how and why they use the tobacco products. But to understand the extent of the tobacco and products and the use of additives in tobacco products, we should look beyond the flavors. Basically, the production of the tobacco products, the modern tobacco products, depend on the additives in certain way. And the first use, it's more clear and more obvious, is to create flavored products. But the additives are also used to reduce the harshness and impact of smoke. For example, my studies on subliminal menthol point out that the subliminal menthol, what is subliminal menthol? Subliminal menthol are the levels of menthol that are not perceived as a menthol taste, are used to reduce the harshness and impact of smoke. And some additives increase the nicotine uptake. The other additives are used to improve the taste of low quality tobacco. So the additives could be used to reduce the price of the tobacco because you don't need the top quality tobacco because we are able to use not so good tobacco. In the past, the tobacco companies used the additives to try to reduce the effects of smoke or mitigate the effects of smoke. For example, the tobacco companies use vitamin A, C, and some antioxidants to try to reduce the effects of tobacco. And just in a spoiler, the results show that the when you put vitamins on cigarettes, you increase the results suggest that you increase the rates of cancer in some products. And you could use the additives to improve the pack aroma. Yes, I'm not wrong. This is correct. So the tobacco companies could be use the aroma and the additives on the package just to give the experience when you open the tobacco products and feel the pleasant smell in the package. People who are addicted by books know the feelings and the emotions that the smell of books could create in our brain. Additives could be used as a combustion agent, and additives could be created to create a product identity. It's not exactly to create a flavored product, but you you use lots of additives in non-flavored products in to create certain notes and certain aftertastes. And you use additives basically allow to to improve the taste of reconstituted tobacco. It's a technology that make the companies able to use these tins and the all rests and all garbage produced on the tobacco production, and you create a kind of sheet of tobacco, and you can use in tobacco to reduce the price. And the lesson, not least important, is to mask the environmental tobacco smoke. The additives are used to reduce the visibility of smoke and the harshness and the impact of smokes to non-smokers. So the additives used affect not only the consumer itself, but affect the people around. And it is a very, very interesting strategy, and especially considering the visibility of smoke, and it was a strategy to improve the social acceptability of the tobacco products. But to understand how this history happened, we should look to the history of the use of the additives in tobacco products. So humans start to grow tobacco in America maybe 6,000 before Christ, and Brazilian natives, because using this snuff tobacco with cocoa and other plants for a long, long time, some thousand years. We don't exactly know how many time, but it's not new. And the tobacco companies start to use the additives in the end of the 19th century on chewing tobacco, and you are able to find flavors like peach, apple, honeydew, strawberry, pineapple, honeysuckle, champagne, and prune in chewing tobacco. But this why the tobacco companies start to use in chewing tobacco and not in cigarettes? Because you have to think that the additives usually are very volatile, so it's very hard to keep the additives in a product that are burning. And the shelf life of these products are not so long as a non-flavored tobacco. For this reason, it's pretty difficult at time to create an flavored cigarette, for example. But in 1929, a guy whose nickname is Spud used it to use the menthol crystals to reduce the cost, but they use the cans of these menthol crystals to storage his cigarettes. And after some time, the menthol are able to impregnate the tobacco and the tobacco paper. So accidentally, this guy created the first menthol tobacco. And of course, the companies researched the use of menthol and discovered that menthol are good not only to facilitate the smoking and to create a pleasant product, but until the 17th, 1917s, the flavored products are very restricted for some segments. But in the beginning of the 17th, you have the rise of the use of additives, especially on subliminal levels, basically to control harshness and irritation. And you start of course, this is the focus on Afro American populations and menthol cigarettes is started a little bit before, but in the 17th, this is very well established, and the strategies to sell the menthol cigarettes to Afro American populations were very clear. In 17th, you have the rise of other flavored tobacco products like water pipe tobacco. And that's funny because in Brazil, some companies complain that the shisha smoke it's something traditional, and to ban flavors on this type of product is some kind of discrimination with the Arabic culture. But they forgot to mention that the original shisha smoke there's no flavor, and the flavors are the flavors were used in shisha tobacco. It's only after 17th. It means it's not something cultural or historical. And you have the first decade of the 20s, and you observe the release of the capsules, flavor capsules, and cigarettes. And the capsules are really disruptive technology because, as I mentioned, flavors are really challenging for companies because they are very volatile. They need to be volatile because basically you're to smell and taste. But when you put the additives on a capsule, you are able to preserve this taste. For this reason, now cigarettes with capsules are able to have lots of flavors. And another technology that are very close to the additive use, especially because the type of matrix you use to consume the product is the electronic cigarettes, because it's a liquid, it's a container. So basically, you are able to use any flavoring additive. For this reason, you have in the market today more than 8,000 flavors. And I read some paper recently, but I forgot the reference. They're talking about more than 10,000 flavors. Actually, this is endless because the combination of flavors are basically infinite. You can, for example, mixture the additives to soft drink with alcohol and polyfruit, and some flavors are really challenged to define. For example, unicorn flavor, and it's even is this type of stuff. It's really hard to classify. So, and considering this development and the spread use of the tobacco, and we aren't able to track how the countries are facing this problem, because nowadays basically the youngs and teenagers use lots of flavored products, and in most of countries, and at least in my experience, the youngers start with the flavored products and after migrate for the non-flavored products. And for this reason, when you look for the code numbers of the tobacco use, cigarette use, okay, that it's easier to compare the countries. And when you look for the total use of the cigarettes, that's weird because most of the cigarettes are non-flavored. But when you look for the type of cigarettes used by teenagers and kids, basically they are flavored products. And so the conclusion by several authors that these products are extremely attractive for kids and and youngers. And of course, it became a huge problem, especially when we are talking about the attraction and the initiation of smoking. And we track it, how the countries face this problem. So you create a map. Of course, this map it's up to date, updated until the end of the 2023. So is it possible some changing? And I'm not talking about the US situation because US situation make my life miserable because the US itself have some restrictions, but each city in the US are able to introduce their own regulations. So it's several hundreds of cities nowadays have some restriction of additives. Some of them are very restricted, include banning of menthol, and other are not restricted the menthol. So it's done my life miserable to to understand how the tobacco additives, flavoring additives are used in the US. But when you look for the map, and you were able, and me and Professor Stella Bialos from UCSF, we are able to classify the regulations basically in four types of regulation. The first one is the functional regulation. This is the type of regulation and the additive ban that's based on the function of the additives. Basically, these regulations tell you are not able to use an additives or substance that are able to change any characteristics of the tobacco flavor or of the tobacco taste because it's not necessarily imposing some specific flavor. It's functional because it's based on the prohibition of the use of the additives whose function is to it's a flavor agent or at least some agent are able to reduce harshness. And as example, I could mention Canada and Brazil. This is this type of regulation. The another type of regulation is the regulation that you call the organoleptic regulation. This regulation is based on the perception of the flavor of the tobacco product. So, for example, this countries that been on based on organoleptic regulation, it's type, for example, cigarettes with the menthol flavor are not allowed, but the use of the menthol as additive is allowed. It's not only for it's it means if the use of additives are able to not impart the flavor of menthol, the use it's allowed. It's a little bit problematic, at least in my opinion, especially on menthol, because when you look for the concentrations of menthol on menthol cigarettes around the world, they are very diverse. For example, in, in the tobacco industry documents mention that in the Middle Eastern, people are able to perceive menthol in very low levels, at least comparing of US populations. And you look for the concentration of real menthol cigarettes, you have, for example, in Japan, that the menthol cigarettes, the concentration of menthol are the I think it's the half of the concentration of the menthol used in the US cigarettes. And you look for the some menthol cigarettes in Europe, it's almost the twice of the menthol concentration used in the United States. So this is, at least in my opinion, a little bit problematic because first it's based on the something that it's subjective because it's a flavor perception, and second, the perception of flavor could be changed depending on the population that you're talking about. and especially flavor like menthol that you are able to be get to develop some kind of tolerance of the flavor. So if the population are use a lot of menthol for any other food or beverage, it's possible that the menthol cigarette has much more menthol. So it's in, for me at least it's a little bit problematic. But European Union that's an interesting approach to try to reduce this subjectivity. They have trained panelists to taste the products, and they have labs to monitor the use of these some selected additives, the most frequently used to flavor products. The another type of regulation, it's not exactly based on the initiation and the attractiveness of the the product. It's actually we track this type of regulation start on Germany on this 1917s. It's the health concern regulations. There's some regulations you find in some countries in Europe and the Arabic Gulf. This is regulations that ban and some compounds that are able to cause cancer or mutagenic in the unburned form. This is so these countries and try to remove these compounds, but I don't find any data if this removal of this compound improve some aspects of the impacts of the cigarettes on the public health. And the last, and you find, I think, 2 or 3 countries that's these countries allow the use of additives and flavors, but don't allow the use of the image on mention that those products are flavored. And you call the packaging regulations. So the mention that, for example, I developed a watermelon cigarette, and I cannot use a watermelon picture or write that this is watermelon flavored cigarette or something like that. So this is the challenge. This is the first challenge that you face when you are talking to about to regulate the additives, because the countries are very diverse in the regulation, and most of countries don't have any regulation. And I conducted a research for WHO, and our first impressions, it's very empirical. It's in the very beginning that it's the most of countries don't implement this type of regulation because it's pretty hard, and you have some degree of knowledge and technical support to implement this kind of regulation. And just to give an example, it, how to address this topic is difficult because the regulations are pretty diverse. For example, some countries ban additives only on electronic cigarettes, and other ban only on cigarettes. So you have to include to compare because even the products, the scope of the regulation have different products. So, but okay, we decided to implement the regulation, and you decide to choose the most restrictive type of regulation, but you never you must never forget that the tobacco companies will face this type of regulation. And in my opinion, this there's a huge the huge strategies and the huge amount of energy and money that tobacco companies use to try to stop any regulations on additives are explained because the importance of this technology for the tobacco products. And back in 2010, 2011, in Brazil, when you implemented the ban of additives, and the Brazil implemented one of the most restrictive bans in the world because we banned any additive that are able to change or the any aspect of the tobacco smoke or the tobacco emission. And the tobacco companies use in the first strategies and very, very hard strategies. And we identified basically 5 big strategies used on the additive bans in Brazil. The lobby, misleading science, public opinion manipulation, and delay regulatory process and litigation. And just to give an example, and there are another one that not described. This one it's about an civil servant from the Ministry of Industry and Commerce that was charged to spy for BAT. Sorry, this is in Portuguese. I think only Grazi and maybe someone from the audience. And there's another one. It's about the lobby and they try to manipulate the public opinion, telling that the regulation will be not allowed to grow the burley tobacco because the tobacco companies argued that this it's impossible to use the burley in cigarettes because they need sugar and other additives. Another strategy, it is a pretty new at time, of course. This because the tobacco companies printed in a form, and we received more than 200,000 letters. I'm not talking about emails. I'm not talking about direct messages or SMS. I'm talking about the old school letters. This is in the very beginning. But after some time, the Brazilian Post Service sent the boxes of processing because they are not able to send the letters as a regular user. And this is just from a small part from one state, RS. It's in one state of Brazil. And this is in a telegram from, it is not a message service, it's an old school telegram. That's the Brazilian Postal Service asking us what happened, what are you receiving so many letters? And at the end, you have to open and read and analyze more than 200,000 letters. And this is another one, it's in a publishing, it's a publication from the institution in Brazil called Oswaldo Cruz Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Sorry, I'm not Oswaldo Cruz. Please forgive me, people from Oswaldo Cruz. It's Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and it is basically this work. This is very weird work because first of all, there is no authorship, and the conclusions basically tell that ban additives it are good for public health, basically, and this is you only affect the production and don't have any benefits to public health. It's the all funded by tobacco companies. And of course, this history in detail, we published a paper on tobacco control telling this history in detail and analyze any strategies and the very complete timeline. And if someone is interested, I can share with Grazi and he can send to anyone. But this is but how we face not only this strategy because actually we basically in Brazil we face this strategies every second from tobacco companies, but how you face this tobacco industry strategies. First of all, it's the good and independent science because basically the good and independent science are very clear that tobacco products are devastating for the public health. But on the other hand, there is no discussion that the kids and teenagers like the sweet products and the flavored products. There's no discussion. So the good independent science are one of the pillars of the good regulation. The second one is a technical comprehension. And this case, I really like to mention. First one is UCSF that's always support us, and the John Hopkins, the Global Institute, were always very good partners to the Brazilian regulatory agents because they always provide a very good science and very good help in most despairing times. And I eternally have to thank the both institutions. And the last one, and it's not very used for regulators, but I strong recommend or policymakers or advocates in tobacco control. is to use the truth tobacco industry documents because we are able to answer lots of arguments used by tobacco companies using their own words. So I just bring some example. For example, the arguments used by tobacco companies that only cigarettes with characteristic flavors are attractive, but menthol and clove cigarettes are exemptions. Okay, the tobacco companies are arguing, but let's look for the what the tobacco companies tell internally about this argument. So this one that's mentioned that the products carry subliminal quantities of metal, and the use of subliminal metal basically it's used to reduce the irritation and to add cleaner aftertaste. It means that not exactly characterizing flavor, but according to our regulation, if you are reducing the irritation and changing the flavor of tobacco, intending to make the product more attractive, so the company are very clear that it's not only the characterizing flavor product, it's attractive to kids. And the research conducted on the truth tobacco industry documents are very clear to show the menthol cigarettes are very attractive and retain, especially younger smokers. So that's no discussion about it. Another argument used by tobacco companies that it's impossible to make American blend cigarettes without additives. Let me explain. We are not familiarized what is an American blend cigarette. And basically, cigarettes in the United States and Brazil and are using a blend of tobacco, basically three types of tobacco: the Virginia, Burley, and Oriental tobacco, and sometimes reconstituted tobacco. But let's talk only about tobacco. And in the case of the Burley tobacco type, the tobacco companies arguments that the Burley tobacco needs sugar to casing to use in the casing process. It's a part of cigarette manufacturing. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to deep to dive deep on the cigarette manufacturer, but maybe in another opportunity. But basically, the argument that the Burley tobacco needs sugars and it's impossible to process the Burley tobacco without sugar. But let's look for the documents. First one, it's a patent, it's invention disclosure that in 1996 that tobacco companies has a patent that Burley uh, will case it with sugar without sugars, without using added sugars. So the tobacco companies have technology to make the casing of Burley without added sugars. And there's another one. It's about the American blend cigarettes with 100% additive free. It's in a 2000 document. So, and another argument that additives like cocoa, licorice are not used to change or improve tobacco taste. This small curiosity. The only industry that buy more chocolate than tobacco companies are the chocolate manufacturers. The all other sweet industry buy less chocolate than tobacco companies. Tobacco companies use lots of cocoa and lots of chocolate and lots of licorice, but the argument that cocoa and licorice are not used to change or improve the taste. But let's look for the what the companies talk about it. In this document, it's 1996 document. This cocoa is used to add deep, heavy cocoa flavor notes and smooth the smoke. About licorice, impart deep, heavy wood flavor notes and imparts slight sweetness. So the cocoa and licorice, according to the own tobacco industry words, are used to change the tobacco taste. And the current status of the additive regulation in Brazil, as I mentioned, litigation, it's one of the strategies used by tobacco companies. And this is, we have an injunction, and the all major companies are allowed to sell tobacco content additives. This is a problem, but we are informed that probably this year the Supreme Court will decide it finally about this topic. But the good part, especially after the use of the tobacco industry documents and the good science, the courts no longer discuss with the additives make the tobacco products may make the tobacco products more addictive or not. There's no discussion about it. It is the courts basically agree that the additives are used to make the products more attractive. So, but when you look for the why the tobacco companies are so fiercey to so aggressive to try to stop, we just need to look to the smoking hates in Brazil, and of course there is no magical bullet. It's it's a group of measures to reduce the smoke prevalence, but because people always say, okay, Brazil, it's a successful, it's a success in the smoking rates reduction because Brazilians don't like to smoke. No, it's not true. First, the nicotina tobacco, it's a plant from the Amazon forest. It's a plant from Brazil. So we use tobacco for at least 10,000 years, maybe, or seven at least. And but when you look for the end of 90s, in Brazilians smoke more than Americans. So, but considering the implementation of the very hard measures to tobacco control, we are able to reduce the smoking hates even to very low and hates and see some measures. And for example, in 2009, we banned electronic cigarettes. In 2012, we banned additives, but unfortunately, it's not effective for the most of companies. In 2013, you banned the toys that imitate the tobacco. In 2018, you ban the exposition of the products close to candies and sweets. And this graph could be explored in more detail in another opportunity. And but the challenges, the first one, especially for the significant part of the audience, it's the need of research and cooperation, because most of the countries around the world don't have any, for example, market research. For most of countries, the first question that I ask when people ask me how we could implement a new regulation or how we could make something, the first question that they need to know and people need to know, it's how many tobacco products are sold in your country, and how many flavored cigarettes are consumed in your country, or what is the hates of the consumption of the flavored tobacco products in youngers. So this is the very simple data, but for the most of the world, you have no data about it. And another need is to look beyond menthol, because menthol it's a terrible additive, because the data shows that people who are use the menthol cigarettes are harder to quit, usually smoke more cigarettes than the people who use non-flavored tobacco. But you need to look because you basically use hundreds of additives, and you look need to look the additives you use to attract the special groups. In our research, you observe the some types of additives are target for special groups like women, like young women and older people concerned about your health. And the tobacco industry strategies, it's a big challenge too. And you need to look for the regulatory needs of the countries, and you need to support low and middle income countries, especially when regarding the technical aspects and the knowledge about it. And I declare no conflicts of interest, as you perceived, and the statements not necessarily express the opinion of Anvisa, but I think they agree with me, the Minister of Health and the Brazilian government. And I'd like to thank you first for the tobacco control of team and the National Health Surveillance Agents, Anvisa in Brazil, because these people are really amazing and they are very few. They are only 11 people, and they are able to reduce significantly the smoking rates and to implement one of the most powerful tobacco control regulations in the world. So this is my not my only my thanks, but my admiration for my colleagues, and they are amazing, and there are so few and so many have to thank you, Dan. I'd like to thank you, the University of California, especially the team for the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. They're amazing people too. They help me a lot. I annoy them every minute asking for for help for any topic. And I have to thank you for John Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, because the beginning of my career are confounded by the John Hopkins, because I was a student for the global leadership. I don't tell how many time ago, because you tell me are I don't like to remember how old I am. But I have to thank you because I start and the first steps on especially looking for the international regulation. And since I still have the contact with my colleagues on the course, and and Joanna and Grazi and every team from John Hopkins, you are amazing too. And especially I like to thank you for Professor Josino Moreira from Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil, Professor Stanton Glantz, my help us a lot too, Dr. Hunt Fiacon from WTO, and Professor Thuy Trong that helped me to prepare the presentation. So thank you so much for invitation. Thank you so much for your attention. And now I think it's time for questions.
What a great lecture. Thank you very much, Andrea, for sharing important information on product regulation, including the technical issues and the challenges that were faced during this process in Brazil. The boxes of letter are very impressive, and it's crazy to see the amount. We already have a couple of questions in the chat, so I will start with that. And the first one is asking if you could explain a little bit about the legislation in Brazil. And if you could say why Brazil decided to ban additives and not only flavors, if that's different, and if that in the legislation it includes flavor capsules too.
Yes, okay, that's a
That's
as
a lot.
usual. No. That's as usual. Grazi has lots of interesting and important questions. We Let's start about first our regulation. Our regulation is based on the function of additives, because this is the first question that you have to do. That is it ethical to improve the taste that the product that cause cancer and cause heart attacks and strokes and several diseases? It's ethical to improve and facilitate the consumption that the product that you follow the instruction of manufacturer, the product will kill the health of the user. And so this is the first basis of our regulation. And second one, the data about how these products are attractive for youngers, it's very clear. There's no discussion that kids love sweets and candies. And but we consider the benefit of the additives first, and we have to look for the structure that you have. For example, the type of regulation that the European Union have, it's impossible for us. For us, it's easier to ban all types of additives, and you consider the change of the taste of smoke. It's already as concerning to import a specific flavor. So we consider our structure, we consider our objective, because we are not banning the tobacco, you are just banning the products used to make the tobacco easy to be consumed, and products that facilitate the initiation. And the tobacco industry documents are very clear. They use lots of additives not to impart the flavor, but to reduce the harshness, because some people don't like the flavored cigarettes, and the established smoker don't like to use the flavored cigarettes. For this reason, you can observe the migration to the flavored product to non-flavored product. But for to make this transition, you need the products that are not harshness. And the another task that is important, the use of additives, that when you reduce the impression of the risk, you diminish the quit attempt of the smokers. So the idea that the product is not so harsh, not so irritating, for this reason, and for I can talk for 1 hour, but I promise to you don't talk too much. But for this reason, we choose this approach of regulation because we think this is more complete, and the objective to protect kids and teenagers will be reached with this type of regulation.
Yeah, and if
And
it includes flavor capsules too.
yes, yes, because it includes any technology on the products for example, the additives on the paper. Because some regulations in the world include only the additives used on the mixture of tobacco, but the tobacco industry documents show to us, for example, you are able to impregnate menthol without to put in tobacco. The first menthol tobacco were not impregnated in the mixture of tobacco. So our regulation includes the paper, the capsules, or any other technology that are able to change or modify the taste.
Thank you. And talking about the types of regulations, someone is asking here if the map that you showed is available for public access.
Not yet. I think we will submit this paper this week or next one. So I keep you informed because we just waiting to I just read the last review of the Stella, and this is and you promise you submit very soon because this map is important. And after the publication, and I compromised myself with John Hopkins and you, Grazi, and I promised to start to discuss with you how to host the map for the public general because this map, and I created an interactive map, and if you click on the country, you are able to see the details of the regulation and some comments and some explanations about how the country regulates the product. But you need a platform, and I think you need to talk because John Hopkins have lots of experience to deal with this kind of matter, and it will be a great pleasure to work together with you. And but I promise very soon, and I keep them informed.
Thank you. And we also have a question here about additives in heated tobacco products. And the person is asking specifically about the lower temperatures in heated tobacco products and how can, if that has any impact in the substance that are produced and in the use of additives.
This is a very, very interesting and important question. But the problem of additives in the any tobacco product, especially the tobacco products developed to be inhaled, that the first one, even the product don't make any heating. The first problem that these additives were tested only for ingestion. And when you compare the how strong is the digestive system, because you have very strong acids, we have liver, we have an assistant that is prepared to consume the garbage that usually you eat. So include some poisons are not able to harm us because you have a very strong digestive system. But when you look for the respiratory system lacks off of the acids, enzymes, and substances that are able to destroy. So even the molecule, its untouched molecule, are able to create some damage. But regarding specifically for heating tobacco product, and the heating, it's about 150 degrees. Please, Grazi, convert to Fahrenheit because despite I'm in the US, I have a lot of difficulties to convert to Fahrenheit. But it is and the 150 Celsius degree to 300 Celsius degree. And even in this temperature, you are able to form just some secondary products and free radicals and in an environment that are not concepted to receive this type of product. Lungs were made to receive air, pure air, dot. It's different for it because if you look for our evolution, you eat rotten food and you don't die. for this. But this is the problem with heated products. Even these products don't have any temperature, they are able to make some damage and some problems.
Thank you. And I'll change a little bit and talk a little bit more about the tobacco industry. We have one question here that says the use of tobacco industry internal documents for counter argument and interference in policy is indeed very powerful. How effective is it based on your experience to use the outdated documents since most of the documents in the trust database were published a long time ago? And how relevant is it to back the current litigation cases?
This is another, that's the question that I really like to answer. And I don't know who made this question, but thank you for this question. First, and the first impression that, okay, the documents are old and out of context, but not. You make some questions about the filters capsules and how the tobacco companies. The first documents mentioned the capsules are from the 1960 or 61. These technologies expend long time to be developed. When you look, for example, for electronic cigarettes, because everyone believed that the electronic cigarettes were invented in China, but there are paper from people from UCSF, Stan, and I forgot the another author, that shows that the tobacco companies developed electronic cigarettes in 19s, but the idea don't go to the market because the law says if you release in a product that is safe, you are admitting that cigarettes are harmful, so you have consequences. So the documents were important because in this context, because if the companies today say, oh, it's impossible to make an American blend cigarettes without sugar, and you find in an old document that they are able to make the American blend cigarettes 20, 30 years ago, that's not possible. They lost the technology or someone forgot it. So in this case, it's extremely useful. Of course, I would love to check in the real-time documents to check the strategies, but they are extremely careful today to not allow it because it's open. But the document is still valid. And when you look for and I start to tell about the history of the use of additives in the end of the 19th century. So, and even to understand how the tobacco companies start to use, and you find even the influence of the filters and the use of additives, and there are many aspects that tobacco industry documents could be used, especially in the arguments that, oh, it is impossible, it's never done before or something like that, and you find in a 40 years document that their technology is very well established, they know the levels of some substances. So of course you have to describe, but it is still very useful. And I have a dream to try to talk someone from the using the artificial intelligence, because the searching mechanism, because the documents are not fitted to be searched, but UCSF did a great job, but the documents are not created or indexed to be searched. And I try to talk for someone at artificial intelligence to try to search. For example, if you put the additives and cigarettes and you have it in 1,000 page documents, and if you have cigarettes on the first page and the additives in last page, this document will be returned in search, and probably it's not useful for our finding. But if we are able to, for example, oh, the round words of the sentence, because not all time you have the additives cigarettes. Sometimes you have additives used in cigarettes, additives that could make cigarettes less harsh. So you have the close words that the regular searching strategies are not fit to search documents. So I'm trying to find someone smarter than me. It's not hard to find to to try to develop this type of search on the documents. And but answered the question, this the document is still useful, especially to support the arguments that something is not possible or you affect, or arguments that, okay, we never sold cigarettes for kids, and you find thousands of documents that tobacco companies systematically create strategies to sell cigarettes to kids. So that they use that you can do? Some another question. The people are very, very good questions.
Yes, we have great questions here in the Q&A. So thanks everybody for submitting their questions and for participating. Unfortunately, we do not have time for any more questions today,
Oh,
but
that's sad.
yeah,
One
time
more, just
one
one
hour,
more,
1 hour
just
goes
one
fast.
more, just one more.
Just one more. All right. So to finish, if you can answer very, very, very quickly.
I promise.
And finishing about the tobacco industry documents, we know that in the US, it has been used as a strategy to tell the public that the industry has been manipulating them. So do you think that this strategy would work in Brazil and South America in general?
In in South American in general, this is very applicable because the type of cigarettes you use in Americans region, it's very similar, with the exception of certain Caribbean countries, but basically the Hispanic, the Iberic countries like Brazil and the rest of the Spanish America, the Latin American itself, the documents are extremely useful because the technology used in the cigarettes are basically the same. Because, for example, just I promise to be a short answer, but I'm lying, miserable fail. Because, for example, if you compare for cigarettes from the Commonwealth, for and it usually they use only the Virginia cigarettes, like Canada. Canada, it's very common. It's just one type. It's not a blend, and the technologies are not necessarily the same. But for the rest of Americas, the market are very similar. Of course, there are some characteristics. For example, in one country in Latin America, we detect a cigarette with 3 flavor capsules. This is a record for me because usually it's 1 or 2, but we are able to detect, and it's not in Brazil. So, but the capsules are still the same, so that is still
Yeah.
valid. And for this reason, the comprehension it's very, very important. And not only for additives, I found documents about the illicit trade in Latin America that's they're very well organized, and the companies work together and the technology are the same. Because
Yeah.
sometimes Latin Americans tell they are very different, but at the end are not so different when you are talking about the patterns of consumption of cigarettes and the type of the cigarettes consumed. I promise I shut my
Thank
mouth
you.
now.
Yeah. I really
Sorry, people.
appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Professor Silva, and everybody who attended today's sessions. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much, everybody.